used this before, and whoa, that was a surprise. So I've never used this wheel before, so I'm going to start small, and then I'll just work our way up, and then I'll do a bit on the newest stuff that I'm doing. So this is just basics of throwing, and what I was taught is how you do it. Fundamentally, from doing lots of thinking in a little cave on my own, which is the majority of pottery, I've come to a few conclusions. I'll just try and work through it. So I'm assuming you all know something about like the centering process and stuff like that, so we'll just sort of try and skip that a little bit and talk about the lifts and things. So moving clay is how you get it under control. You sort of see a lot of people, quite often you hear people saying sort of like force the clay into centre, and clay is a fluid. It's a colloidal suspension, so fluids can't be compressed, which is how hydraulics works. So if you're trying to centre by pushing down on top and pushing in from the side and shrink the clay, it just can't. So it'll eventually push back and you'll be sent off centre, and it'll get very, very frustrating. So moving the clay, thinking of it as a fluid rather than a solid, will bring it into line. So coning up and down is basically so that you're getting that movement in the clay. Now if I rock the clay over and I don't push down at all, it still comes down. And that's because there's a little bit of compression in a bend. So without any actual effort from me, just a slight bend in it, it'll come down. And if I just stay reasonably still, it self-centres, because that bend is pouring the clay into itself equally because of the spin. And that works on all the sizes, basically. So you take a lot of effort out like that. So there shouldn't really be too much strength in this process. Opening up, again, it's about economy of movement. I was talking about how fast you move does not make you a quicker potter. How economically you move makes you a quicker potter. So to open up, instead of drilling a straight well, I was taught to make a sort of like slanty ramp thing, and then I've got the weight here. And again, you see a lot of people trying to open up and hold the wall, but again, you're trying to compress the clay when it doesn't want to compress. You'll get the little walls falling and the little bits of wobble. Doing this has brought the weight of clay to the outside edge. We'll turn this into a cylinder. I didn't think what I was going to do then. We'll turn this into a little cylinder. So now all I have to do is compress that small amount of ramp into the base, and I've got all of the meat without too much movement and stretch coming over to the outside edge. The first lift I like to use is a heel lift, left heel lift. It's usually for big wear. I was taught it was by Kevin, it was more for big wear. But again, with the economy and the practice, I thought, well, why not just use it for everything? And then I'm practicing the same move and I'm getting used to it. So this lift is quite a funny looking one. And we lift up and in, letting the clay fall through the fingers, and then just use your webbing to recenter. And I'll sort of go through that a little bit more detail with some of the other balls. The next lift, and we're going to do a cylinder, because everything is a cylinder unless it's a bowl, and then it's a bowl. But everything else starts as a cylinder, and the basics of it are a cylinder. The next lift is just to take a knuckle under and lift that wall up and in. And that will thin it out a bit. And then your final lift, you don't have to do things in three if you don't want to, you just get the shape you want, so don't worry about that sort of thing. That'll come later. Consistency is more important than these magic rules that are sort of nonsense. You will eventually get so you're doing it in 2 or 3 pulls, but it's not something to like have as a sort of like albatross over your neck sort of thing. Because it really doesn't matter. If you're getting a nice pot at the end and you need to do it slowly, as long as you're getting consistency. It's a bit like, I used to do archery, and we used to say a consistent grouping is more important than hitting the target where you want to, because you can move a consistent grouping. Because once you've got consistency, you've got understanding of material, and then all you have to do is improve where that consistency goes. But if you're going with this sort of, sometimes it's nice, sometimes it's not, it's the clay and me deciding together, then you're not in control of the clay. Clay doesn't have an idea, it's mud. You know, you control the mud. It's not thinking. Although sometimes it is, because it does have a personality, but that's a bit later on. So the final pull, which I was taught, which is a really useful one, is you actually go out from the inside and lift. And I'm just lifting off the rib there. The rib magnifies the knuckle. So really good potter on YouTube is Guy Wolf, big ware flower pot maker. He does some really... You've got to type in flower pots or you get banjos. So he does loads and loads and loads of banjo videos and about 6 flower pot videos. So you've got to type in flower pots, so you're just going to get banjos all the time. Well, he's a very good maker. He's been all over the world learning different techniques. So I'll sort of explain... Oh, I need the way. Why those things do that now. Sorry, I'm really sweating because wedging's horrible. Just get that water out. Also, the whole sort of like minimum water thing doesn't really mean anything. The sort of like, oh, use a thimble of water per pot or using too much thing. That sort of, there's a lot of, in my head, and you can disagree with me if you want, I don't mind, I can be wrong. There's a lot of miscommunication from sort of like multiple cultures doing it their way, and you just grab a little bit of it. But if you're not empathic to the entire situation that they're working with, you will confuse yourself as to what you're doing with your situation. We have very, very good quality clays in England. We've got very beautifully plastic clays. The manufactured ones, they just do whatever they want with because they're geniuses of, you know, clay technology. Places like Japan, where you throw... I was over there, oh, bloody hell, ages ago. I worked with a bloke called Hiroki Numaguchi, who's just died last year. And he was the last, it's quite interesting, he was the last potter in Japan, Jommenware and Haniware, who had a direct lineage through his family back to the original Jommenware potters. I didn't realise how famous he was in Japan until we sort of went around Miyazaki and Kyoto and stuff, and he went, this is a sculpture they had me commission, and I went all over the world getting handprints from famous presidents for this one, and I was like, oh shit, that's cool. Yeah, because he was just a bloke at a party. So that was quite nice, and I worked with him, and they have quite appalling quality clays from what I could understand of it, and it's very, very groggy. It's very lacking in plasticity, so they get their plasticity from wetting the clay down a lot. So if you've got a very, very wet clay because you lack plasticity, you have to use very little water or it's just going to break apart. It's going to dissolve very quickly because the more water is in it, the further apart the particles are, so the more water can get in. You haven't got like the resistance from the meniscus. So a little bit like an umbrella, you know, it is not water impermeable. It creates the meniscus and then the water runs off the edge. Sort of thing like marbles in a tube. So anyway, rambling a little bit there. So when you've done a basic cylinder, you're basically just mucking back, and you're going for consistency. I'm quite glad that worked. I should have done it the other way and squashed it if it wasn't. So, oh no, stop. So when you, I'll just fiddle with this. Yeah, oh, you can see, oh, I'll go, no, that way. Right, that's probably easier. When you do the first knuckle and you push in, you're invariably going to get a buttressing effect here. And that's where the sort of like horrible thick at the bottom, tapered at the top thing happens. So the reason for the last lift to be a push out, and I'll watch it off there. So when I push out, I'm pushing out all the way off the edge. So there's nothing above my original base. And then when I lift up, all of that weight, that's now become a right angle, and all of that weight is up in the wall. So then that's evening up your wall, and it will take that, and you can get extra whatever depending on the weight of clay there is. So I'll just quickly whack another cylinder out, and we'll talk about sort of like the way the hand positioning works for the lifts on these. That one will do. Get a bit more water, Doc. Cheers. Okay, that'll do. So, like I was saying before, where's my thingy? Like I was saying before, everything to move clay happens in a basic sort of transitional curve. Let's hope this one's just as just as good. It's not too bad. There's quite a bit of this idea of pinching from centering, and you often see people saying sort of like fingers opposite each other and try and pull the clay up. So if you have a bit of empathy for the clay particles and their happiness, and like what's happening with the physics of it is, a colloidal is very strong under compression. It's very, very weak under tension in pull forces. So I like to imagine it as being like statically charged balloons in a root. So if you can push the balloons together and let them naturally come back out, the static will hold them together, but it's very easy to pluck a statically charged balloon off each other. So when you're sort of squishing the clay like this and lifting, one of the first things you're doing is taking all of the compressive weight of the pot above off what's below your fingers. You're lifting that entire body off. So all of the torque that comes from the spin of the wheel and the drag from the extra friction of pinching is going to create buckling here. And then everything's exponentially greater with the physics as you go bigger. So stuff you can bully out of a 500 gram lump, you'll get a bit harder on a kilo, and then when you go up to 6, 7, 8 kilos, it's just never going to work. And you generally get the idea that, well, I've been doing this like this for years, so it can't be my technique. But it's just a bad technique can overcome small imperfections in the physics, but the physics is always the same. So instead of that, if we have a hand that's quite a bit higher than the other, and we're passing through the clay, all I'm having to lift is the architecturally weak shape of the S-bend. It falls back into an architecturally strong shape of a straight cylinder, and it comes from an architecturally strong shape of a cylinder. And even that, just mucking about like that, has lifted the wall an inch. Because that's all you're actually doing. You know, there's no difference between doing that now and doing that when the wheel is spinning, other than you're touching all of the clay, and if you just keep doing that now, you'll only lift one bit. The clay doesn't know that it's spinning. We don't know that we're spinning. We're just sat here. We're hurtling along at millions of miles an hour. You know, and the world doesn't know that it's orbiting. It thinks it's going straight, like the gravity well makes it curve, and that's sort of similar to what's going on here, because you've got gyroscopic planes of effect. So there's ways of imagining it, and there's different ways of imagining it depending on your brain. So if you imagine it as being a vertical line of repulsion from gravity, because everything's got equal and opposite and all of that, and the horizontal spin of the wheel is always to the clay a horizontal spin of a wheel. So when you bend the clay, it's as if you're pitching the spin on an angle, which is a little bit like putting a thread on a rod. So you don't wrestle a nut when you're trying to tighten it and try and push it along. It's the spin that moves it. So it's the spin and the angle that moves it. So it's the same with clay. The spin and the angle is what moves the clay around. What have I done so far? I've done that. Yeah, so then sticking with cylinders and thinking about that curve and the architecture, if we've got to think about sort of the shapes that you make with your hands. Your hands are just sort of a tool, and you change the shape of your tool depending on what you're doing. But the clay really only experiences one thing, which is going through the same sort of bends as the knuckling. But there's times that it looks very, very different because of where the clay is. So at the beginning, excuse me, shouldn't have had a burger. At the beginning, we can't make the inside hand and the outside hand because there's nothing there to push against. So we can't make the full S-bend. So the first lift that you saw me do, I'll just sort of explain that a little bit, is creating the bottom half of the S-bend. So the left hand is coming in to do a lift, and the right hand here is compressing and holding on to this. And the outside little finger is very important with this because that creates stability in the wall. And as we hold on to that, and you can see there, oh, it's a bit dry, the curve, it will come up, it's gone a bit dry, and because we've done that, it will fall into place. And going through those curves, there's a curve. Can we do a top one? So there's a curve from the push. I'll just look at my own hands actually for that. So there's a curve from the push. There's a curve going this way, as well as the curve that comes on the inside here. So it's sort of like it's twisting round, and that keeps the clay from going all wibbly wobbly. You might get a little bit of it, but you just use your webbing to recenter at the top. And again, because of the sort of gyroscopic effect of spinny things, as long as the rim is centred and the base is centred, the middle can be a wee bit wobbly. You can just belt it about a bit. If I recenter that, then we can still pull up, and it won't distort because the gyroscopic force will hold it in place. You also keep the weight at the top, because there's structure in the sort of like colloidal bond that's there. So if you end up thinning your rim as you go, when you start distorting down the bottom, there is no structure at the top to keep it stable. So then that will start to flibble about a bit, and then your clay will fall over, and it just gets really frustrating. But if you're not, you've got to be thinking of this is a material science before it's a creative art, and the more you can learn about the material science and the physics and the chemistry of it, the more free you are to create the things in your head. There's no point having wonderful ideas if you can't make them happen, but there's a lot of point to be able to make wonderful things even if they're quite normal. So it's always good to just, and all arts are crafts generally first. Great painters learn their craft before they go off and do weird and wonderful things. Great sculptors learn their craft before they do weird and wonderful things with that. So this is a little bit wobbly, but we'll keep it. So I assume we all understand what was going on there. That is the same for colouring in as well. I was being asked by somebody about colouring in yesterday, so I thought I'd just whack it into this demo, because I'm sort of winging it. I hope this is all okay. So again, the clay doesn't know where it is in space. It doesn't know what it's doing down here. It doesn't know what it is. It's just an inert thing. So we only ever deal with the bit that we're dealing with, and the rest of it is just there. So the same as when we do the lift here, if we're wanting to colour in, this is a Persian lift that I was shown by Kevin. We do the same thing. We bring out that rim, lift and press in, like that. And we can come all the way in nicely. We've got the compression to control. We don't get a wibbly wobbly bit going on up there. And then you maintain your thickness, because obviously as the circumference shrinks, the weight of clay thickens, and then it goes through the normal path of the bottom half of the S-bend or the full S-bend, and then that thins it again. So you end up with an even wall coming in, which is where the sort of this is wobbling a bit. I'll just straighten that up. The sort of, this is what I was taught before I met someone that knew what they were doing. So it's the more common, the sort of lifting like that. You're not giving any structural support or compression to the base. You get the little wobble, and then you get a pin, which I haven't got because I don't use pins, so I'll just do this. And then you pin it off, and then you've widened it up again, so then you sort of go back to doing that little thing, and then you get another wobble, and you start having to throw it like that. And you can end up looking perfectly right, but quite often when you've done that, you've thinned this shoulder so much that when you glaze it and you fire it, the glaze comes off because it's not been able to grab enough from the dip or something. It becomes a naked bit. And it's not got the structure in there. So that's why, that's another reason to sort of try and bring that in as well. And that's basically cylinders which make everything but bowls. So I'll just do a bit on the standard of a bowl, because it is all a little bit backwards. A tall, thin thing starts fat and wide, and a bowl that is wide starts tall and thin. And there's a lot of sort of the opposite way round stuff in pottery. Throwing's a pretty hard one to get a head around. I've had to think about this, and I think throwing can be seen as being like the harder one or the more skilled one of the making processes, but that's sort of wrong, because becoming excellent in anything is just hard, and that's it. You know, a really excellent hand builder, a really excellent sculptor, a really excellent thrower have just gone through the process of trying to become excellent, and it's just hard to become excellent. So I don't think there's a hierarchy of making processes. I think that comes from the inherent understanding of what you're doing. So if you're hand building with slabs or something like that, it's part of the normal natural world that we've evolved in. We don't really come across spinning amorphous blobs when we're hunting and have to shape them into nice shapes before we can eat. So we're sort of training a bit of the brain that's dealing with a form of physical world that we don't have any evolutionary relationship to, which is where just getting your head around it at the very beginning can take longer than getting your head around putting some slabs together, because you know there's IKEA and woodwork and stuff like that. So bowls sort of start with a taller little bump, and we start off making a little bowly sort of shape. And this isn't the shape of the bowl. This is so that you have a thickening wall as you come down, so it's got the support. And the first lift is sort of similar, but we sort of stop and let the rim be a bit further out. And the first thing to do with a bowl is just set the rim. So we take up the rim, come up and out in this. Whoops, pinched it a bit there. It's a bit soft in that bit. We didn't wedge it very well. I'm just going to start that one again. Also, don't be bothered if you get it wrong. Preciousness over your pot kills your pot. Get so that you don't care. Well, not care, because obviously you want to make nice things. Getting to the point at which it doesn't matter if it goes wrong, can you just whack another one up? It'll give you freedom to then get life into the pieces. So don't be too precious with things, because you can't get flow into something that you're overly tentative over. So I'll just quickly. So the next pull is up and over, and we're setting, again, if we're thinking about the particles, there's always a natural drift towards homogeny with clay. So if we bring up a cylinder and then stretch out, all of the particles on the outside rim, and also it being like ridiculously thin when you do that, a little bit further apart in their suspension than these ones. So as it dries or as it's fired, your rim might lift up or it might flop down depending on where the angle is. If we bring it out under a compressive pull, then this is equally dense to what this is, and it won't move so much. And the same with plates and stuff like that. It's a quick little pull like that. So this is about has everybody heard about a lot of people talk about the arch in a bowl and then start making a bowl shape and trying to make the bowl shape bigger, which sort of works on a little scale. And then as you go to a bigger scale, obviously the exponential growth of physics, your bowl starts getting wobbly in the rim and it starts getting frustrating, and as you get frustrated it gets more wobbly. That's because the words that are being used are correct, and again, like, this is just my take on it, so you can just not believe me, that's fine. The words that are used on it are correct, but it's sort of the understanding, because obviously everybody thinks of an arch and they think of the full arch. So a bowl looks like a full arch, but a bowl is that way up, and we don't make arches that way up because they're shit and they fall down. So this is an arch, and it's half of one. And that is an arch, and it's half of one. And the colloidal bond and the downward force of gravity is creating that stable. So even if I belt that really quite hard, that isn't going anywhere. And then I can just bring that into a bowl, and we can sort of, all right, that went a little bit wrong, mate, we whacked it a bit too hard there. And we can still pull it out. As soon as we, oops, not used to this wheel, that's normally off. As soon as we go into a bowl shape, I'll just quickly bung another one up. As soon as we go into a bowl shape, we've removed that gravitational pressure. So that is still compression, because gravity is creating compression. I'll just bang this up. So that's compression. So whatever distortion I'm doing down here, the arch still exists up here, and that compression still exists. As soon as we come into a bowl shape, there's no compression. We're now very, very gentle, and it's going all over the place. So I know no one goes around slapping their pots to try and make them, but that's fundamentally what you're doing when you're distorting it to make it throw. You're distorting the bottom, and if you haven't got structure in the top above what you distort, and you're allowing it to react to that distortion, then it'll all go wrong, basically. So that's bowls and that's cylinders. And how long have I been doing this? Because, I don't know, what have we got, 45 minutes? I've been doing it half an hour. Okay, all right. And so that's basically that. And then I said I'd do a bit on the new sort of stuff that I'm doing. So once you've learnt all of that, I think, what's his name? Hamada said, spend half your life learning what to do and half your life forgetting it. I prefer fuck with the process, but obviously, sorry if anyone... So I should have said I might swear. Whoops. So, where's the black clay gone? Oh, this will do. Porcelain, that will do. So, I've been mucking about because it's the process process-led stuff is always nice. And again, considering the materials, there's also a thing in Japan that says a third the potter, a third the clay, a third the kiln, and they have this thing of like if you go past that and try and give too much to one than the other, you get an unbalanced pot. I quite like that because excessively contrived stuff for me is sort of dead. And pottery is a really violent process in my head. So we're sort of working with the same sort of forces as make planets. We're melting rocks and we're growing crystals and it's loads of heat and all this sort of thing. So the material that you're using and its natural properties are quite interesting to me, and quite like the idea of trying to display them. So I started mucking about this with porcelain, and porcelain's quite an interesting one. If you start working with porcelain, you're finding it a wee bit baggy because it's thicostropic. Best thing to do is put Epsom salts in with it. Because bigger particle clay is easier to deflocculate and harder to flocculate. So like a bentonite is pretty much impossible to deflocculate, it just goes a bit funky. And obviously porcelain is the biggest particle of clay you can get because it's primary clay, it's kaolin. And all clays started as kaolin, and loads of geological activity rotted them down into secondary and tertiary clays and things like this. So even though it's thought of as fine porcelain, it's actually chunky, like internally. So I started sort of thinking about this, and so what was I saying? Epsom salts will flocculate, so if you're losing plasticity, because we deflocculate for the slip housing process in making clay, it's already thicostropic, and a lot of porcelains have sodium in them from like a soda feldspar, and that will leach out, and sodium is your deflocculant. So if you use a bit of Epsom salts and wedge it into even a fresh bag, which I've not done this because we haven't got any Epsom salts, you'll actually notice after about 2-3 minutes it'll become rock hard, because then your plasticity is coming from the water suspension rather than from the magnetic repulsion of deflocculation, because deflocculation is sort of like all the charges on the clay particle matching the charges on the water, and you get like a magnetic repulsion to create fluidity, so you can get density into your fluid for casting, and then you've got a rapid casting process, or you've got more material in the bag press process than if you just had to have lots more water and lots less particles. So that's quite it all gets a little bit very interesting, really. So anyway, so I started mucking about, and I quite like, someone told me that Picasso said, when you make a mistake, repeat it and then you own it. And everybody's made something right nice, and they're dead happy with it, and then they've caught it with their finger, and they've gone, oh, shit. So obviously I've done that. So I thought, well, let's repeat that and see what we can do with it. And I was working out of Stoke for a bit, because I graduated from Stoke, and I was with a bloke called Stuart, who's a mate, who's a collector, and he just bought in a load of Buller's porcelain. It was quite interesting that David Ems used to do a bit, or was it David Leach? Some David that's famous used to do some work. I think it was Ems. Yeah, did a range with them and stuff. And Buller's made the rings, but they also made the isolators, and that reminded me of something I tried to do when I was doing the sort of like more sculpturally, conceptually stuff that you do at uni, when you don't really know what you're doing, so you never get it right. So it's always good to remember what you used to think of, because there's no such thing as a bad idea. There's just the inability to create it properly. But as you mature as a maker or a doer of things, it's not that when you were a first-year student, this idea you had was shit, and that's why it didn't look right. It's just your craft skills were immature, so you didn't know how to apply that idea properly to what you're doing. So I thought I'd revisit that, because I used to have this idea of throwing out little. I quite like the idea of like throwing in a way that isn't thrown. So sort of throwing horizontally after you've made something. So I did a bit of mucking about with that, which is just sort of like throwing something thick and then pinching off like that, and then this has taken a little while to develop this idea, and then sort of throwing that straight out. And I sort of that was it in my uni idea. I thought, well, I'll just muck about with that, and then the shadows and stuff like that, because I did a industrial design degree, which is very, very clean, industrial pots and stuff, and they're very nice, and they're immensely controlled, but you can sort of lose a bit of life by being too controlled. So I sort of started doing that, and then I looked at it and I thought, well, that's just boring, really, because it's just lines. So I thought, well, so maybe that was a bad idea. So then I sort of thought, well, you know, you can sort of knock it and it starts getting interesting. So then I just sort of grabbed my rib a bit and just ragged about it like that, which is not what you're supposed to do normally. You don't get taught this on a night course. And then I thought, well, I can trim that off then, and if I bring that out, because I really quite like the soda silicate stuff and all of that folk are doing, but I don't like the regularity of pattern. And this isn't a very well thrown one, because it's just done. And then no, still not, no. So then that swelling that out, like, opens up all that texture that we've just mucked about, and you get some really just interesting shit going on, interesting stuff going on. And you can't get these textures from sodium silicate and scratching through it and a bit of blowtorch. Sodium silicate's it's a physical bond, so it's like a gummy thing. So it's like you've covered it in glue. It's a bit like the same as painting on a balloon and inflating it. Even if you put some scratches through it to make some sort of difference, there'll always be a regularity to the break. Once a fracture has happened, a bit like with glass, there becomes a regularity of pattern. And I didn't really want regularity of pattern. And I didn't really want the limitation of texture that gave you. Because, like, crunchy, wunchy stuff's nice. But then, in my mind, just doing the sort of crunchy, wunchy, wobbly stuff, is it a good pot? Or do you just not know what you're doing, so you've applied a process that hides that you don't know what you're doing? So then you've got to have sort of like a proof of intent in what you make. So this would normally dry out, and I'll put a very, very refined turned foot on, and then like sort of try and refine this. I'd refine the rims and stuff. So your texture is inhabiting a part, and then how you've dealt with the rim and how you've dealt with the foot being a bit of precision shows that you have chosen to make heavy, wobbly, cracked, lumpy mess on purpose. But if I just did a wobbly, crunchy foot and a wobbly, crunchy rim, then everyone here is going to go, that's shit. So you just sort of don't want that, generally, especially not trying to make a living at it. So I started playing with that, and that was quite nice. I did that in Celadon. That was quite nice. So then I started doing it in the black clay, and there's no point me repeating it because it's just making a mess. And that's sort of where I'm developing the sort of like, I'd say it's like the European art house, design house sort of end of what I'm doing. Because you do the normal stuff as well, because that's fun. And that's all sort of process led. So I make a lot of porcelain, and then I've got a lot of reclaim, and nobody likes reclaim. So I thought, well, what can I do with this reclaim? So then I started putting it onto my stoneware, because then it'll crack apart and it'll do an effect. And then I started making this in black. And I thought, well, what do I do with this reclaim? So I made that into a slip and started putting it on my stoneware, and then I started putting that over the top of it, so then it had that nice duality of like dark and light. And then I don't have to do as much reclaim. And that's where that idea came from, avoiding work. And that's about all I can think of. Is that all right?